special guest with us today on the sidelines of the IFA Mumbai Congress, former OECD Tax Policy Director Jeffrey Owens. We caught him last year. We're going to catch him again today for his take on all the contemporary tax issues, and there are many. Mukesh, of course, from BMR is also with us. Jeffrey, my first question, no surprises, BEPS. Pascal Amans told us in an interview, we are halfway there. What's your take, where we are, and where are we headed in the next 12 months?
I think, the OECD has done a great job. They've met their deadlines. They delivered their 7 action points to the Ministers of Finance in September, yeah? But the real challenges are to come, yeah? Because in a sense, many of the reports that were put in September, there's still a lot of open issues on the details of the legislative proposals, issues that relate to implementation. So I think it's the next 12 months that are going to be the key, and what we have to look at is what's going to be on the table of the heads of government in the autumn of 2015, yes? That's what we need to be looking at. I'm sure that, in fact, the OECD will deliver, yeah? But the question is, are they going to deliver products that have a real consensus and make meaningful changes?
Mukesh, any specific questions?
Yes, since we are on delivery and implementation, we were not very clear whether this framework of agreements that they're talking about as an integral part of the action point, will that trigger off an automatic amendment to the treaties, or will it be a kind of a framework agreement which the G20 will agree that will sit all on the tax treaties?
Yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this multilateral instrument. Yes, some people think it's a multilateral convention. That's not the case. Yes? Well, this is a multilateral framework by which you can update bilateral treaties. Yes? So it's not replacing the treaties. It's just putting in a mechanism that can automatically update them once countries have agreed on what the substance of the changes would be, yes? Why is that important? Because if we don't do that, we'll run into the situation that the OECD has faced for 30 odd years. We agree on changes to the model, and then it takes 10 to 15 years to get them implemented. That creates a lot of uncertainty, yeah? I mean, once you've agreed on an amendment, why can't we say, fine, we agree that we'll implement it very quickly. So I think it's a key thing, because otherwise we're going to face the situation that you're going to get agreement on some of the BEPS recommendations, and then to get those agreements implemented is going to take 5, 10, 15 years. Not good for business, not good for government.
Jeffrey, are you surprised that the digital economy framework has not, there is no consensus as yet? So is it something that you were expecting? Because that was one of the centerpieces.
Which economy framework?
Digital economy framework.
I'm not surprised. I mean, just because it was put as Action 1 doesn't mean it was the most important, yeah? It was put as Action 1 because perhaps it was the most difficult to get agreement on, yeah?
But the OECD statement does not inspire confidence that a consensus is coming soon on the digital economy question.
I think that's not entirely true, because one, the report that was put out in September was very much an analytical report of what the issues are, yes? And they've also committed to have a second report for September 2015, yes? So in a sense, I mean, OECD is doing its usual good job of, you do the analysis, and then you get with the recommendations. The one good thing that has come out already is that there's not going to be special rules that apply for the digital economy, yeah? Which makes sense, because how do you define the digital economy? I mean, a company like GE, a company like Siemens, a company like Unilever, they're just as digital as Global or Facebook, yeah? So if you can't define the economy, how can you have separate rules? But I do think, and this is to me a concern I have, is a large part of the Action 1, if you ask the BRICS, why was Action 1 important? That was important for them because it was a way of beginning a debate on source and residence taxation, yes? Sure. How are the rules that we have on PEs, on attribution, do they reflect the realities of today? And that seems to have slipped off the table, yes? Largely because our American colleagues don't want it on the table, yeah? But I mean, that's a missed opportunity, because this project is the one chance that we have of actually saying, let's get a real consensus between the OECD countries and the BRICS. And you put those countries together, it's 90% of the world economy, yeah? So if we can get that consensus, it's a big step forward. And for business, it's so important, because does a business really care whether it pays taxes in India or in the United States? I don't think so, yeah? So if you get that consensus, then you'll see the number of disputes decline. And I think that business is making a big mistake by lobbying against that, by saying, no, don't get into the discussion of source versus residence. There needs to be that discussion. This is the opportunity. You don't take it, it's not going to come up for another decade or two, yeah?
Mukesh, we've made impressive progress on TP documentation.
Yes, absolutely. But I think moving away from BEPS, your quick reactions on the IFA Congress topics and its relevance in the context of today's world. Because there are two ways to look at some of these congresses. One is that there's a whole bunch of intellect that's floating around thinking about the future of the policy. The second is actually, for some people, the congresses leave us with more questions than we had before we actually attended these sessions. What's your take on that?
I always think identifying the questions is far more difficult than identifying the answers, yes? Because if you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to be moving forward. So I think IFA plays a useful role in getting people, getting tax professionals to think about issues that they don't think about when they're sitting behind their desk. And I'll give you two examples. The seminar that we had yesterday on the future tax with Mr. Desai, yeah? That was actually saying, why do we have to focus on today's problems? Let's focus on the problems coming up in 10 years. And I think there's a lot more that could be done by IFA to have this forward-looking perspective. Another example is the work on the seminar that's going to be tomorrow, on Thursday, on the link between trade, tax and investment agreements. Again, that's a new topic. And if you ask the average tax professional here, how do you treat taxes under a bilateral investment treaty? Yes? How is taxes treated under free trade agreements? Yes? They wouldn't know. And yet it has implications for their work. So in a sense, there's an awareness raising function of IFA, of saying, for a moment, for a few days, you're going to step back from your regular job, and we're going to encourage you to think about issues that are going to get on your agenda in the next year or two. So that's a very useful function.
Jeffrey, quick comment on tax inversion in the US. You think there will be a bill by the Senate?
I don't think there's going to be anything substantive passed at the legislative level until after the next presidential election. Yeah, irrespective of what comes out in the elections for the Senate. Yeah, it's stalemate, and I think it's going to stay stalemate for the next 2 years. Yes? I do think that the United States needs to get serious about tax reform. Yeah. And it has to be a bipartisan consensus, because you're not going to have successful tax reform if one party proposes it and the next party unwinds it, yes? So there needs to be a real debate, and I don't think that debate can be just limited to the corporate taxes. I think there has to be a debate of the whole US system, yeah? It's a country that needs more revenue. I mean, if you drive around the US, the potholes are even worse than here. There are bridges that are falling down, there are airports that are not functioning. All of that requires more revenue. The current tax base in the US can't supply that, yes? So I think if you're going for a reform, start preparing for it now, but make it a reform that covers the corporate income tax, make it a reform that covers the personal income tax, and to look at new ways of taxing consumption.
Any advice for the Indian lawmakers, given the dynamic nature of our tax regulations and the increasing role that India is playing and is likely to play in a bigger way in international trade and commerce?
I always say that India is now at a crossroads. You're very lucky with the government. I mean, some people describe the government as pro-business. I think it's pro-India. It may be the same, yeah, but it is pro-Indian. Yeah? So there's an opportunity here, in fact, of making real changes. I was very pleased with the Revenue Secretary's statement yesterday that they recognize that uncertainty, unpredictability is bad for foreign direct investment. And if you actually look at the figures coming into India, you're not getting the investment that you should.
Yes.
I mean, people forget, if you went back 20 years, the GDP levels of India and China were roughly equivalent. Yeah, today it's 1/4. Yeah. So, and how do you change that situation? You attract foreign direct investment. But without the foreign direct investment, you're not going to get up to the growth, because you have a growth rate of 4-5%, yeah? You should be up 8, 9, 10%, yes? How do you get that foreign direct investment? To get the foreign direct investment, you need to look at your regulations, you need to look at your land policy, but also you need to look at your tax system. And the tax system is not the structural features, it's the way the system is administered. It's a win-win situation of reducing uncertainty, reducing making it more predictable, and the number of disputes. I mean, India has become the land of disputes, yes? I'll see you in court, that's what people say. It doesn't have to be that way, but that does require change from the top. And I think it also requires the Indian government to reconsider its position on arbitration, yes? Because arbitration is just not a way of solving disputes. It's a way of sending a message to the Revenue Service that you need to look carefully at whether the cases you bring are going to stand the scrutiny of an independent panel.
So since we are on dispute, I agree with you, disputes doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the government, it doesn't help investors. But there is a debate in our country to seek resolution under alternate dispute resolution mechanism. For example, arbitration under the treaty. I think you are very familiar with India's view on arbitration. Do you see this view changing? And if you were supposed to advise the Indian government and influence their view in resorting to arbitration under tax treaties, what would you advise them?
But very interestingly, Mukesh, just to add, the Indian Minister of State, Nirmala Sitharaman, at the G20 meeting, raised the issue of India's sovereignty while talking about arbitration.
That is a red herring, because I mean, I launched the work at the OECD on arbitration in 2000, yes, and countries that are currently advocating arbitration, like Japan, like the United States, I was having the same message. This is not possible because of sovereignty issues. This is not possible because of constitutional issues. That is a political cover. Yeah, the reality is you can do it here in India. India already has arbitration under your BITs, your bilateral investment treaties, yes? So there can't be constitutional problems. Yes? And I think you have to see the issue of arbitration in a much wider context. Yes? It's not just saying that's the way of resolving disputes, it's also a way of saying that's a way of minimizing disputes arising. Because if tax officials know that at the end of the day they have to go and defend their position in front of an independent arbitration panel, I think that will make them much more cautious in the positions that they take. And if I were the finance minister here, one of the most effective ways of changing the culture in the tax administration is actually by saying we will start moving slowly and on our terms towards arbitration. Yeah? And I say slowly because that is going to take a number of years. It's not so. We need to resolve all the issues that have been put on the table by developing countries, the concerns that they have. Yeah, and that's why at Vienna we've now launched this major 3-year project on arbitration and dispute resolution, and I very much hope that India is going to get involved in that.
Last question, Jeffrey. In the last 12 months, since we did the interview at Copenhagen, and there's been so much outsized focus on BEPS, on GA, on tax planning avoidance, have you seen any fundamental change in mindset in either tax professionals or the taxpayer or in the corporate boardroom? Or in the IRS?
I think the short answer is yes. Yeah, some countries more than others, but I think in the vast majority of countries, both OECD and non-OECD, there is definitely at the corporate level a recognition that things have changed. That they must learn to operate in a much more transparent environment, that they are going to have to provide information on country by country, the master file. And I think a lot of corporations, at least those that are in a proactive phase, they recognize that and they're beginning to approach that. On the government side, I think there has been change, some positive, some negative, yeah. The negative is that there are about 20-25 countries that have preempted some of the BEPS outcomes, countries like Australia or France. Yeah? That makes it more difficult, I think, to get a real consensus. Yes? On the side of the tax professionals, I think increasingly tax professionals are recognizing their business model has to change as well. They often ask me, is it the end of tax planning? And my answer is, it may be the end of tax planning as you've done it in the past, but there'll always be tax planning as long as there's taxes.
In the context of governance?
In the context of
Yes, well, I mean, as a tax advisor, I mean,
more than 25 years.
Yeah, I think, I would say tax planning now in the context of governance, and not just in context of tax governance, but a tax planning idea which can be a subject matter of scrutiny by your board, by your CEO, because if it invites any bad press, I think you, as in your capacity as head of tax or as a tax advisor, could be pulled up. So I think tax planning in the context of governance is the right thing to say.
That's a very nice way of presenting it, and I think I would complement that by saying that any planning that you do, you have to defend it, not just in the courts but in the media, yes? Absolutely. If you're comfortable with a scheme getting on the front page of the headlines that you can say why it's that, then it's fine, yeah? You should be able to defend it, yeah? So, and I very much agree also that we have to see the whole issue of tax compliance in this broader context of corporate governance, yes? Because at the end, compliance and your attitude, your tax management has to be determined by the board, and they have to look at not just whether you can get the effective tax rate down, they also have to look at what's the impact on our reputation, what's the impact on our financial liabilities, and what's the impact on our employees. People forget that. I mean, young generations, they don't want to work for companies that are seen as being antisocial, yeah? Because they're not paying their fair share of tax. So I think there is that change coming, and I think it's a good change. It's a very difficult change for professionals to adapt to, yeah? But I mean, you're tax professionals, you have to be not just technicians, but you have to be tax diplomats these days.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for joining us, and
my pleasure.
we'll see you in Switzerland next year soon.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.